There is a forbidden truth they never told you. Desire is not a magnet. It is a mirror. It shows you who you believe yourself to be. Change the reflection, and reality rearranges itself. Neville Goddard made this correction very clear when he said that desire reveals a state. It does not produce results. Desire is diagnostic, not creative. The moment you want something, you have unconsciously confessed that you are not occupying the state in which that thing is natural. Neville used the simplest and most confronting analogy possible: hunger. Wanting food does not feed you. Thinking about food does not nourish the body. Even visualizing food does nothing to end hunger. Hunger ends only when the state of being fed is entered. And the moment you are fed, the desire disappears automatically. You do not suppress it, manage it, or affirm against it. It dissolves because its job is finished. In the same way, desire does not bring fulfillment. Fulfillment brings the end of desire. This is where much of modern manifestation language quietly misleads people. The language of attraction suggests that you are pulling things toward yourself as though reality was separate from you and needed convincing. Assumption-based creation, which Neville taught, moves in the opposite direction. Nothing is attracted, nothing is summoned. Consciousness simply occupies a position, and the world rearranges itself to reflect that occupation. Life does not respond to what you ask for. It responds to what you assume yourself to be. When attraction language is used without this understanding, it keeps the individual in a subtle posture of reaching, hoping, and waiting, always oriented toward an object, never toward identity. Modern neuroscience has begun to echo this same truth in different terms. Dr. Joe Dispenza often explains that personality creates personal reality, meaning that the habitual identity you live from determines the patterns you experience. This is not a contradiction of Neville's work. It is a confirmation of it. Personality, identity, state. These are different words pointing to the same mechanism. Your emotional habits, your self-concept, your inner posture toward life quietly instruct the world how to treat you. Reality does not argue with this instruction. It mirrors it with remarkable fidelity, even when the reflection is unwanted. So the premise we must sit with is simple, but it is not easy. Life mirrors who you are being, not what you are wishing for. Wishing belongs to the language of distance. Being belongs to the language of fulfillment. As long as desire is treated as a creative force, the individual remains oriented toward absence, mistaking longing for progress. But when desire is understood correctly, as a signal pointing toward an unoccupied state, it loses its power to frustrate and gains its true purpose. It becomes an invitation, not to want more intensely, but to become more accurately. There is a quiet discomfort that arises when you truly examine the act of wanting, because beneath its surface it carries an admission most people would rather not face. Wanting is not neutral. It is not innocent. Wanting is consciousness announcing that it is not where it wishes it were. The moment desire appears, it exposes a perception of absence, a subtle internal stance that says, "This is not mine yet." This is why wanting feels restless by nature. It keeps the mind oriented toward what is missing rather than what is present, and over time that orientation hardens into a lived experience of delay. Imagine someone standing outside a beautifully furnished house, gazing through the window with admiration. They comment on the elegance of the space, the warmth of the lighting, the comfort suggested by every detail. Yet they never enter. They remain outside, talking about how much they would love to live there, how inspired they feel by what they see. No amount of admiration from the outside changes the fact that they are not inside the house. In the same way, desire keeps consciousness positioned outside the state it longs for. It studies it, dreams about it, and even reveres it, but it does not occupy it. And as long as consciousness remains outside, life reflects that position faithfully. This is why desire, when misunderstood, quietly sustains separation. It trains the individual to relate to their fulfillment as something distant, something ahead, something conditional. Even when desire is dressed up as motivation or positivity, it still carries the same structural flaw. It places the self on one side and the fulfilled state on the other. The mind may argue that intense wanting should count for something, but reality does not negotiate with intensity. It responds only to position. Where consciousness stands is what life mirrors. At this point, a necessary question begins to form, even if it has not yet been spoken clearly. If wanting does not create, if longing is actually evidence of separation rather than movement, then something far more fundamental must be at work. Something must be shaping outcomes that has nothing to do with effort, emotion, or desire itself. And this question, once allowed, begins to reverse everything most people think they know about how reality responds. What begins to emerge once desire is properly understood is a reversal so complete that it can feel destabilizing at first. The question is no longer how to get what you want, but who you are being while you want it. Neville Goddard stated this with striking clarity when he said that an assumption, once persisted in, hardens into fact. This was not poetic language. It was a technical description of how consciousness operates. An assumption is not a thought you occasionally think. It is a position you occupy. It is the quiet agreement you live from, often without noticing it, and life responds to that agreement with absolute consistency. To understand this, consider the function of a passport. A passport does not care about your dreams, your hopes, or how badly you wish to be in a certain country. It does not respond to emotion or intention. It simply identifies who you are in relation to borders. The moment it is presented, access is either granted or denied, not because of effort, but because of identity. In the same way, your assumed identity determines which experiences you are allowed to enter and which remain inaccessible, regardless of how sincere your desire might be. This is why identity is the only true magnet. It does not pull, it permits. It does not chase, it authorizes. When consciousness assumes a state, it does not ask reality to deliver evidence. Reality is compelled to comply because the assumption defines what is normal, what is expected, and what is allowed. There is no waiting period built into this mechanism, only a delay created by hesitation, inconsistency, or divided allegiance between who you are and who you imagine yourself becoming. Here is where many people unknowingly stall. They attempt to visualize a new identity from a distance, as though watching someone else live a better life. They admire it, imagine it, and even feel inspired by it, but they do not step into it. Identity cannot be admired from afar. It must be occupied. Consciousness does not move by observing. It moves by being. The moment this distinction is grasped, the entire framework of manifestation shifts from effort to embodiment, and the search for techniques begins to fall away. One of the most quietly revealing truths about human experience is that the same desire held with equal sincerity does not produce equal results. This observation alone dismantles the comforting idea that desire itself is the creative force. If wanting were enough, outcomes would be far more uniform. Yet life demonstrates again and again that two individuals can long for the same thing with comparable intensity, speak the same affirmations, and even visualize similar scenes, while their realities unfold in entirely different directions. This difference is not accidental, and it is not a matter of luck. It is evidence that desire is not the determining factor at all. What actually determines the outcome is the state from which the desire arises. A state is not a fleeting mood or a passing thought. It is a stable inner posture, a psychological and emotional arrangement that defines what feels normal, possible, and expected. When desire emerges from a state of confidence, familiarity, and inner permission, it carries a very different quality than desire emerging from insecurity, longing, or self-doubt. On the surface, the desire may sound the same, but internally, it is being generated from two entirely different identities. Reality does not respond to the words of desire, it responds to the state that gives those words meaning. An effective way to understand this is through the analogy of radio frequencies. Two radios can sit in the same room, exposed to the same invisible field of signals, yet play completely different content, depending on how they are tuned. The radio is not exerting effort to receive one station over another. It is not trying harder or believing more strongly. It simply receives what matches its internal setting. Consciousness operates in precisely the same way. Experiences are not attracted through effort or emotional charge. They are received through resonance with an occupied state. This is why certain outcomes seem to follow some people with ease, while others struggle endlessly for the same results. One person's internal frequency makes success, respect, or stability feel ordinary, even expected. Another person may consciously desire those same experiences, but internally relate to them as distant, exceptional, or fragile. Life reflects this distinction faithfully. It does not ask what you want. It answers who you are being. When an outcome feels natural to the identity, it appears with little drama. When it feels foreign, it remains elusive, no matter how passionately it is pursued. This understanding removes both blame and false hope. It shows that there is nothing wrong with desire itself, but it also reveals its limitations. Desire does not need to be intensified or purified. It needs to be understood as a signal pointing back to the state that is currently occupied. The moment attention shifts from the object of desire to the identity from which that desire is being generated, the mechanism becomes visible. Change no longer feels like a battle against circumstances, but a quiet recalibration of the inner frequency. When the state changes, the outcome cannot remain the same. This is not because the world has been persuaded or influenced, but because it has no choice. Reality always mirrors the state in operation. The difference in results between people is not a mystery. It is a reflection of identity in action. There is a subtle but decisive shift that occurs when the concept of the end is finally understood, because the end Neville spoke of was never a future event waiting to arrive. It was a psychological condition already complete within consciousness. Most people hear the phrase, living in the end, and immediately imagine scenes, images, or future moments they hope to experience one day. But this misunderstanding keeps the end safely out of reach, framed as something ahead in time rather than something available now. The end is not a picture you visit. It is a state you inhabit. When the end is truly entered, wanting collapses naturally. It does not need to be resisted or corrected. It simply dissolves because it no longer serves a purpose. Wanting exists only as long as consciousness believes something is missing. The moment that belief changes, the emotional posture shifts with it. This is why Neville emphasized that the end is not about forcing feelings or maintaining excitement. It is about arriving at a quiet inner knowing that what was once desired is now normal, settled, and assumed. An effective way to grasp this is to consider how the body responds to temperature. If you walk into a cold room wearing a heavy coat, the coat feels necessary. You are aware of it. You may even be grateful for it. But if the room slowly warms and you realize you are comfortable without it, you do not argue with the coat or analyze it. You simply take it off. The action is effortless because the condition has changed. In the same way, wanting falls away when the inner environment changes. You do not stop wanting through discipline. You stop wanting because the psychological climate no longer supports it. Living in the end means relating to life from the assumption that the matter is settled. There is no internal negotiation, no silent checking to see if it is working, no emotional leaning toward a future payoff. The state carries a sense of closure, even if no external evidence has appeared yet. This is often misunderstood as pretending or denial, but it is neither. It is an internal agreement about identity. Consciousness has accepted a new position, and from that position, the old patterns of longing feel unnecessary and even strange. This is also why living in the end cannot be sustained through effort alone. Effort implies maintenance, and maintenance implies instability. The end, when entered correctly, feels natural precisely because it aligns with identity. There is a quiet ordinariness to it. The mind no longer circles the desire obsessively. Attention returns to the present moment. Emotional energy stabilizes. These are not techniques, they are symptoms of having shifted states. What makes this transition challenging is that it does not announce itself with fireworks. There is no dramatic moment where you feel permanently changed. Instead, there is often a subtle sense of relief, as though something heavy has been set down. This relief is the signal that consciousness has stopped reaching and started resting. And it is from this resting place that the next phase becomes possible, because there is a doorway where identity shifts most easily, where effort quiets, and where the end can be entered without strain. There is a reason Neville placed such importance on the state akin to sleep, and it is not because it is mystical or rare, but because it is naturally disarming. In this state, the sharp edges of the analytical mind soften, and the habitual defenses of identity loosen their grip. SATS is not about forcing images or controlling thought. It is about entering a threshold where consciousness becomes receptive rather than directive. At this level, effort loses its usefulness, and suggestion becomes powerful precisely because resistance has quieted. In ordinary waking awareness, identity is protected by repetition. The mind rehearses who you are through familiar thoughts, familiar emotions, and familiar reactions. These repetitions act like guards at the gate, ensuring that only experiences consistent with the current self-concept are allowed entry. SATS bypasses these guards. It does not argue with them or overpower them. It simply moves around them by lowering the volume of conscious interference. This is why Neville emphasized drowsiness rather than intensity. The softer the state, the deeper the impression. The process can be likened to ink meeting paper. When ink is pressed aggressively onto a surface that is not receptive, it smears or sits on top. But when the paper is absorbent, the ink sinks in effortlessly, becoming part of the page itself. SATS works in the same way. Identity is not rewritten through strain, repetition, or emotional force. It is impressed gently, allowed to soak into the subconscious where assumptions are formed and maintained. The change is subtle, but it is structural. What often surprises people after working in this state is not an immediate transformation of circumstances, but a shift in their internal reactions. Situations that once triggered anxiety, longing, or doubt begin to feel muted. Old emotional responses arise, but they no longer carry the same authority. This is not because the emotions are being suppressed, but because the identity they belong to is losing relevance. The subconscious has accepted a new assumption, and the old self begins to respond as though it is being slowly phased out. This is where misunderstanding can occur if one is not attentive. After an identity shift, the old self often reacts. Thoughts may surface that contradict the new assumption. Emotions may attempt to reassert familiar patterns. This is not a failure of the process. It is evidence that the process is working. Habitual identity resists replacement, not because it is powerful, but because it is practiced. Like a reflex, it fires automatically, even when the conditions that created it are no longer present. SATS does not demand that these reactions be confronted or eliminated. It simply continues to impress the new state until it feels more natural than the old one. Over time, the subconscious reorganizes around the new assumption, and the emotional landscape adjusts accordingly. Desire, which once felt urgent and unresolved, begins to change its tone. It no longer pulls forward. It fades into a quiet certainty, signaling that identity has shifted from wanting to being. One of the least understood aspects of inner change is the role emotional habit plays in maintaining an outdated sense of self. Emotions are often treated as reactions to life, as though they are produced by circumstances and justified by experience. But in reality, emotions are far more loyal to identity than to events. They arise automatically to confirm who you believe yourself to be. This is why the same situation can evoke confidence in one person and insecurity in another. The circumstance is neutral. The emotion belongs to the state. Over time, repeated emotional responses begin to feel like personality. They become familiar, predictable, and strangely comforting, even when they are unpleasant. Anxiety, disappointment, or longing can persist not because something is wrong, but because they are rehearsed. These emotions function as evidence for an old self-concept, quietly reinforcing it through repetition. When identity begins to shift, these emotional habits often surface with surprising intensity, as though attempting to reassert their relevance. An effective way to understand this is through the analogy of muscle memory. Imagine reaching for a light switch that has recently been moved. Your hand goes to the old location automatically, even though you consciously know it is no longer there. The action is not deliberate. It is conditioned. Emotional habits behave in the same way. They arise not because they are true, but because they have been practiced. When a new identity is being assumed, the old emotional reflexes continue to fire for a time, simply because they are familiar pathways in the nervous system. This is where many people misinterpret what is happening internally. The reappearance of old emotions is often taken as proof that nothing has changed or that the new state has failed to take hold. But this conclusion overlooks how identity actually reorganizes. Emotional habits do not dissolve instantly when a new assumption is impressed. They lose authority gradually as the subconscious receives consistent evidence that a different state is now in operation. The old reactions feel loud not because they are powerful, but because they are accustomed to being listened to. What matters in this phase is not emotional perfection, but allegiance. Identity is not defined by the absence of old feelings, but by which feelings are allowed to define reality. When the individual no longer treats habitual emotions as instructions, their influence weakens. They may still appear, but they no longer dictate meaning or direction. The center of gravity has shifted, even if the echoes of the past are still present. This is why persistence, as Neville used the term, has nothing to do with force or emotional intensity. Persistence is loyalty to being. It is the quiet refusal to abandon a new identity simply because the old one is still speaking. Over time, what was once habitual becomes irrelevant. Emotional patterns reorganize themselves around the new state, not through confrontation, but through disuse. The adversary was never an external force. It was familiarity mistaken for truth, and familiarity loses its grip when identity moves on. When identity has shifted and a new state is quietly occupied, the way results unfold often confuses those who expect dramatic confirmation. Many imagine that change should arrive with unmistakable signs, sudden miracles, or emotional highs that announce success. Yet Neville consistently emphasized that the bridge of incidents is natural, almost unremarkable in its appearance. This is not a flaw in the process. It is its defining characteristic. Reality rearranges itself in ways that feel logical, sequential, and ordinary precisely because the change has already occurred internally. A bridge of incidents is not a single event, but a chain of seemingly unrelated moments that move life toward the fulfillment of the assumed state. Each step appears reasonable when it happens. None of them demand belief or celebration. This is because the world is not trying to convince you of anything. It is simply conforming to the position consciousness now occupies. When identity changes, the external world does not need to shock you into agreement. It reflects the change quietly, as though it had always been this way. This subtlety is often misunderstood. People look for proof that something extraordinary is happening, and when they do not find it, they conclude that nothing is working. But extraordinary signs belong to the logic of wanting, not being. When you are already identified with a state, confirmation loses its urgency. You do not need life to impress you because internally the matter feels settled. This is why the bridge of incidents rarely feels magical. Magic implies surprise. The bridge feels more like inevitability. One of the clearest expressions of this is found in social interactions. After an internal shift, people may begin treating you differently without any explicit explanation. Opportunities appear through casual conversations. Circumstances align through what seems like coincidence. Yet nothing announces itself as a turning point. There is no moment where the world pauses to acknowledge the change. Instead, the new treatment feels oddly appropriate, as though it were always meant to be this way. This ordinariness is not evidence of insignificance. It is evidence of alignment. As the bridge unfolds, emotional responses continue to normalize. There is less excitement and less anxiety. Events that would have once triggered strong reactions now pass with relative neutrality. This neutrality is often mistaken for indifference, but it is something else entirely. It is the emotional signature of stability. Consciousness is no longer oscillating between hope and doubt because it is no longer oriented toward a future outcome. It is resting in a present assumption. This emotional neutrality is one of the clearest signs that the process is complete. When the state is truly occupied, life no longer feels like something that needs to be managed or monitored. Events unfold, adjustments happen, and circumstances shift without requiring constant interpretation. The bridge of incidents carries you forward not because you are pushing it, but because there is nothing resisting it. Reality is simply following the path that identity has already laid down. At a certain point in this unfolding, something quieter and more profound begins to reveal itself. The focus subtly shifts away from outcomes, states, and even identity, and turns inward toward the one who was doing the wanting in the first place. This is not an intellectual curiosity. It is an experiential recognition. Desire, which once felt so central and urgent, begins to appear almost impersonal, as though it belonged to a character you once played rather than to who you are now. This recognition marks the threshold Neville referred to as the promise, though it is rarely understood in its depth. Up to this point, desire has functioned as a guide, pointing consciousness towards states not yet occupied. It served a purpose, even when misunderstood. But once identity stabilizes and the bridge of incidents unfolds naturally, desire loses its authority. It no longer defines direction or meaning. What remains is awareness itself, observing the movement that once felt so compelling. This is where the great reversal completes itself, not as a technique but as an awakening to the nature of I am. Neville often emphasized that I am is not a statement of affirmation, but the fundamental fact of being. Before any desire arose, before any identity was assumed, there was simply awareness. Desire came later, as a movement within consciousness, not as its source. When this becomes clear, there is a profound sense of release. The individual realizes they were never chasing fulfillment in the world. They were mistaking movement within consciousness for something external. Desire was never pointing outward. It was pointing inward, toward recognition. An effective way to understand this is through the mirror analogy Neville used so frequently. When you stand before a mirror and raise your hand, the reflection responds instantly. But if you misunderstand the relationship, you might try to manipulate the reflection directly, hoping it will change first. At some point, it becomes obvious that the mirror was never the source. You were. The mirror never moved. You did. In the same way, reality was never withholding fulfillment. Consciousness was simply learning to recognize itself. This realization changes the emotional texture of life. Desire no longer feels like a problem to be solved or a signal of lack. It is seen as a temporary movement, something that arises and falls away without defining you. There is a growing sense of stability beneath experience, a feeling of being anchored in something that does not fluctuate with circumstances. This is not detachment or withdrawal from life. It is intimacy with it, free from the tension of needing it to complete you. As this recognition deepens, the question of manifestation becomes almost secondary. Outcomes still occur. States are still occupied. Life continues to unfold, but the urgency that once drove the search dissolves. What remains is a quiet clarity about identity, not as a role or a self-concept, but as being itself. And from this clarity, the final instruction arises naturally, not as a command imposed from outside, but as a recognition of what has always been true. What emerges when everything is seen clearly is a truth that is both disarming and liberating. Desire does not manifest. Identity does. Desire was never the creative force. It was the indicator, the signal that consciousness was oriented towards something it had not yet accepted as natural. Once this is understood, desire loses its authority to frustrate or mislead. It is no longer treated as a tool or a problem, but as a temporary message pointing back to who you are being. This is why attraction language, while appealing, often obscures the deeper mechanism at work. By focusing attention on objects, outcomes, or circumstances, it keeps consciousness externally oriented, subtly reinforcing the idea that fulfillment exists somewhere else. Neville's teaching moves in the opposite direction. It places consciousness at the center and reveals that the world is not something you persuade or influence, but something that reflects self-recognition. Reality does not respond to effort. It responds to identity. Neville's mirror analogy brings this into sharp focus. A reflection does not change because it is commanded or corrected. It changes only when the one standing before it moves. In the same way, life does not rearrange itself because you want it to. It rearranges itself when consciousness occupies a different position. The reflection always follows self-recognition. There is no lag built into this relationship, only the appearance of delay created by divided identity. Modern language has begun to echo this ancient insight. Dr. Joe Dispenza explains that sustained identity change restructures life automatically, not through willpower, but through coherence. When the inner state stabilizes, behavior shifts, perception reorganizes, and experience follows. This is not a method layered on top of Neville's work. It is a confirmation of it from another angle. Personality, identity, state. These are different names for the same organizing principle. What remains now is not theory, but recognition. The instruction is not to seek, chase, or intensify desire, but to rest consciousness where fulfillment is assumed. Tonight, as the surface mind softens and effort releases, there is a doorway where this shift occurs naturally, where identity can be experienced rather than imagined. In that quiet threshold, the one who was wanting gives way to the one who already is.